The sound of paper sliding across polished wood is softer than you'd think. It doesn't echo. It doesn't announce itself like the career-ending document it actually is. The conference room went completely silent when my boss, Marcus Hale, pushed that single sheet toward me with 2 fingers, like it might contaminate him if he touched it too long. Everyone else stared at their laptops, suddenly fascinated by spreadsheets they'd seen 100 times before. "Your role has been reduced effective immediately," Marcus said, his voice flat and professional, the way you'd tell someone their parking validation expired. I looked down at the paper. My bonus line was crossed out in red ink. My title, Senior Contract Architect, the one I'd earned after 3 years of 80-hour weeks, was replaced with Associate Project Coordinator. My project, the Riverside infrastructure contract I'd designed from foundation to finish, was reassigned to Kyle from accounting, who couldn't meet my eyes across the table. My hands started shaking under the table. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, feeling the cheap polyester of my work pants, counting my breaths. I asked quietly, keeping my voice steady even though my throat burned, "Why?" Marcus leaned closer. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp. His voice dropped low, meant only for me, the kind of whisper that doesn't get picked up by meeting recordings. "You should have been more cooperative, Megan." My stomach twisted. I forced a smile because crying here, in front of the VP of Operations and the entire contracts team, would destroy whatever dignity I had left. I nodded once, stood up slowly, and walked out of that glass conference room with everyone watching me like I'd just been diagnosed with something contagious. My name is Megan Brooks, and everything that happened after that moment started 6 months earlier, when Marcus first called it mentorship. The first time felt harmless. Almost flattering, if I'm being honest. Marcus stopped by my desk after everyone else had gone home, leaning against the partition with his sleeves rolled up like he'd been working just as hard as I had. The floor was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the cleaning crew vacuuming somewhere on the 3rd floor. "Still here?" he asked, even though he could clearly see me surrounded by contract drafts and highlighted printouts. "Just finishing the Riverside proposal," I said, not looking up. I was on a deadline, trying to calculate load-bearing requirements for a pedestrian bridge that needed to support rush-hour foot traffic and occasional maintenance vehicles. "You work too hard," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me glance up. He was smiling, but not the way he smiled in meetings. This one was different. Softer. More personal. "Just want to get it right," I said. He asked if I had plans for the weekend. If I lived alone. If I liked working late because I preferred the quiet or because I didn't have anywhere better to be. Questions that felt friendly at first, until I realized they had nothing to do with work. I laughed it off politely, made some excuse about needing to finish up, and left 20 minutes earlier than I'd planned. I told myself I was overreacting. Marcus was just being nice, trying to build rapport with his team. That's what good managers did, right? The next morning, my calendar exploded. For new deadlines, all marked urgent. A site visit scheduled during my dentist appointment. A request to redo an entire section of the Riverside contract because the client changed their mind about specifications I'd confirmed in writing 3 weeks earlier. Something shifted in the office after that night. Nothing I could point to directly, nothing I could report to HR. Just a coldness in the way Marcus looked at me during team meetings, like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. I threw myself into the Riverside project like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. The contract was the biggest our firm had ever handled, a $20 million infrastructure redesign that would put us on the map if we executed it correctly. Marcus made it clear that this was my chance to prove I belonged in senior-level negotiations. I stayed late every night for 2 months. Cold coffee and vending machine dinners. I caught mistakes in the engineering surveys that would have cost us $500,000 in change orders. I rewrote the safety protocols 3 times until they exceeded state requirements. I even fixed errors in the documents Kyle and the other junior architects submitted, correcting their load calculations and permit applications without telling anyone because I didn't want them to look incompetent. Marcus praised me in team meetings. "Megan's carrying this project," he announced one Monday morning, and everyone clapped. I felt proud. Validated. Like all those late nights and skipped lunches were finally paying off. But in his office afterward, when I asked about the senior architect promotion I'd been promised, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Promotions aren't just about technical skills, Megan. They're about loyalty. About being a team player." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I nodded and left. I told myself I was imagining things. I was tired. Paranoid. I just needed to keep working hard and everything would work out. I ignored every warning sign and kept pushing forward. The second private meeting happened 3 weeks later. Another late evening, another excuse about wanting to discuss my career trajectory. He closed his office door this time, which he'd never done before. "You're talented," he said, sitting on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, too close to where I sat in the chair across from him. "But talent only gets you so far in this industry. You need sponsors. People who'll fight for you when promotion decisions get made." "I understand," I said carefully. He smiled. "Do you? Because sometimes I think you don't realize how much I've been advocating for you. How many times I've had to defend your work to people who think you're too aggressive. Too ambitious." My stomach dropped. No one had ever called me aggressive. I met deadlines. I didn't argue in meetings. I fixed other people's mistakes without complaining. "I appreciate everything you've done," I said, trying to sound grateful while also trying to figure out how to leave without making things worse. "Loyalty matters more than talent," he said again, and the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't talking about working weekends or taking on extra projects. I stood up slowly. "I'm here to do my job well," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "That's what I'm loyal to." His smile faded. Just for a second, I saw something cold flash across his face before the professional mask slid back into place. "Of course," he said. "That's all any of us want." I left his office and went straight to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and tried to stop shaking. The punishments started small. So small I almost didn't notice at first. Emails disappeared from threads. I'd send a question to the team and get no response, only to find out later that Marcus had replied to everyone except me, making decisions without my input. My suggestions in meetings were suddenly ignored or credited to other people. Kyle presented my revised safety checklist to the client and got praised for his thoroughness. I told myself it was just office politics. Nothing personal. But then payroll called me in for a routine review and quietly informed me that my bonus structure had been changed. Not eliminated, just restructured. Instead of getting paid quarterly based on contract milestones, I'd now receive a discretionary year-end bonus that Marcus alone would determine. When was this decided? I asked the HR coordinator, a nervous woman named Felicia who wouldn't make eye contact. "Last month," she said, sliding the updated paperwork across her desk. "You should have received an email." I never received an email. I checked my inbox 3 times, searched my deleted folder, checked my spam. Nothing. "Can I appeal this?" I asked. Felicia's expression told me everything I needed to know. "You can submit a request, but those decisions usually come from department leadership." Department leadership meant Marcus. I signed the paperwork because I didn't know what else to do. My hands were shaking again. Rent was due in 5 days. My mom's medical bills from her surgery were stacked on my kitchen counter, and I'd promised I'd help. I went back to my desk and started saving every email I'd ever sent or received. I created a folder on my personal laptop labeled Work Backup and began documenting everything. Not because I was planning revenge. Just because I needed to feel like I had some control over what was happening to me. In public, Marcus called me indispensable. In front of the executive team during quarterly reviews, he praised my dedication and attention to detail. "Megan's the backbone of this project," he told the VP of operations, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe things were getting better. Then he blocked my vacation request. I'd asked for 4 days off to visit my mom after her follow-up appointment, time I'd cleared weeks in advance. He denied it without explanation and assigned me weekend work reviewing permit applications that could have easily waited until Monday. A coworker named Angela pulled me aside after a meeting. She was older, maybe 50, and had been with the firm for over a decade. "Be careful with Marcus," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "He has a pattern. He builds people up, makes them dependent on his approval, and then he turns on them if they don't play along." "Play along with what?" I asked, even though I already knew. Angela looked at me sadly. "Just watch yourself." I started keeping a journal. Not anything formal, just notes on my phone. Dates, times, comments Marcus made, meetings where my work was reassigned or credited to someone else. I didn't know what I'd do with the information. I just knew I needed proof that I wasn't crazy, that this was actually happening. The big presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early September. The Riverside contract was ready for client approval, and I'd been preparing my presentation for weeks. I knew every detail, every calculation, every contingency plan. The conference room was packed. The client's CEO, their head of operations, our executive team, and Marcus, sitting in the back with his arms crossed like a principal observing a teacher. I presented my work for 40 minutes. I walked them through the timeline, the cost projections, the safety protocols, the community impact assessments. I answered every question with specifics, pulling up reference documents I'd prepared in advance. When I finished, the room applauded. The client's CEO shook my hand and said, "This is exactly what we needed. Outstanding work." I felt like I could finally breathe. Maybe this would be enough. Maybe Marcus would see that I was valuable, that I deserved respect and fair treatment. Then he stood up. He smiled at the room and began summarizing everything I'd just presented, rephrasing my points as if he'd been the one developing the strategy all along. "What our team has built here," he said, emphasis on our, represents a new standard for infrastructure contracts. I sat down and smiled because that's what you do in these situations. But something inside me hardened. Something cold and final clicked into place. I stopped hoping he'd be fair. I started planning for what came next. The isolation accelerated after the presentation. Coworkers stopped inviting me to meetings. Calendar invites I used to receive automatically just stopped coming. I'd find out about decisions secondhand, through forwarded emails or offhand comments in the break room. My access to shared project files disappeared overnight. I submitted a ticket to IT, assuming it was a technical error, but they told me my permissions had been manually revoked by department management. Then Kyle, the junior architect who'd taken over parts of my project, confessed something during lunch. We were sitting outside, away from the office, and he looked miserable. "Marcus told me to shadow you," he said quietly. He called it transition planning. He said you'd be moving to a different role soon and I needed to learn your processes. "What role?" I asked, even though my stomach was already sinking. Kyle shrugged. "He didn't say." "I thought you knew." I didn't know. Nobody had told me anything. I was being erased from my own project, slowly and deliberately, and everyone around me was just following orders. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every conversation, every meeting, every decision that had led me here. I thought about quitting. Just walking away, finding another firm, starting over somewhere that didn't make me feel small and powerless. But then I remembered my mom's medical bills. My rent. The career I'd built. I'd worked too hard to let Marcus destroy everything just because I wouldn't let him treat me like I was something he owned. I decided to start documenting everything more carefully. Not just emails, but patterns. Timelines. Evidence. The payroll shock hit me on a rainy Tuesday in October. I checked my bank account expecting my quarterly bonus, the one tied to the Riverside contract milestones we'd just completed. The deposit never arrived. I called payroll. Felicia answered, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice before she even explained. Your role changed last month, she said carefully. Your bonus structure is now discretionary, remember? But I hit every milestone, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The contract is ahead of schedule. The client approved everything. I understand, Felicia said, and she sounded genuinely sympathetic. But discretionary means it's determined by your direct supervisor. You'll need to discuss it with Marcus. I hung up and sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen without seeing anything. Rent was due in 3 days. My mom's follow-up appointment was next week, and I'd promised to cover the copay. I had $17 in my checking account. I felt sick. Dizzy. Like the walls were closing in. That's when I decided to stop being afraid and start being strategic. If Marcus wanted to play games with my career and my livelihood, then I'd need to understand the full scope of what he was doing. Not just to me, but to everyone. I started compiling project files. Contracts. Email chains. Meeting notes. Anything I could access that might show a pattern of behavior. And that's when I found the safety warnings. The documents were buried in an old shared folder, one that hadn't been updated in months. Safety inspection reports from the Riverside project site, dated back to June, flagged multiple structural concerns that needed to be addressed before construction could proceed. I remembered those reports. I'd written several of them myself, documenting issues with soil compaction and drainage that could compromise the foundation integrity. I'd submitted them to Marcus with recommendations for remediation work. But the versions in the folder now were different. Dates had been changed. Entire sections were missing. Signatures were altered to make it look like the issues had been resolved when I knew for a fact they hadn't been. My hands went cold. This wasn't just about office politics or personal grudges. This was a safety issue. If construction proceeded with those unresolved problems, people could get hurt. I made copies of everything. The original reports I'd saved in my personal backup. The altered versions in the shared folder. Email chains where I'd flagged the issues and Marcus had responded with vague assurances that he'd handle it. I didn't know what to do with the information yet. I wasn't ready to blow everything up. But I saved it all carefully, organized it by date, and stored it in an encrypted folder on my laptop. Just in case. The second refusal happened on a Friday afternoon. Marcus cornered me after a client meeting, blocking my path to the elevator with his body in a way that looked casual but felt deliberate. We should grab dinner, he said. Talk through some things. Clear the air between us. I could feel other people watching from their desks. Waiting to see what I'd do. I have plans tonight, I said politely, trying to step around him. He moved slightly, still blocking my path. Tomorrow then. Or Sunday. I'm flexible. I appreciate the offer, I said, keeping my voice steady and professional, but I think we can address any work issues during office hours. His jaw tightened. For just a second, the mask slipped and I saw real anger flash across his face. Then he smiled, stepped aside, and said, "Suit yourself." The next morning, my performance rating dropped. I found out through an automated email notification. My quarterly review score had been downgraded from exceeds expectations to meets some expectations, with notes about attitude problems and difficulties with team collaboration. I read it 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee and a sinking feeling in my chest. None of it was true. But it was in my file now, official documentation that I was a problem employee. I forwarded the email to my personal account and added it to my growing collection of evidence. The conference room betrayal happened exactly the way I described at the beginning. The glass walls. The paper sliding across the table. The demotion. The bonus withheld. The whisper meant only for me. You should have been more cooperative, Megan. I packed my desk in silence that afternoon. I didn't argue or cry or make a scene. I just carefully removed my personal items, my framed photo of my mom, my coffee mug, my spare phone charger, and walked them to my car in 3 quiet trips while everyone pretended not to watch. Kyle had already moved into my old workspace. My name was gone from the project directory. It was like I'd never existed. But I wasn't done. I was just getting started. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table and built a timeline. Every meeting. Every email. Every altered document. Every punishment that followed each time I'd set a boundary. I organized everything chronologically, cross-referenced it with my journal entries and saved correspondence. I didn't do it with anger. I did it with the same precision I'd used to design the Riverside contract. Every step calm and deliberate. Every detail verified and documented. Because I'd learned something important over the past 6 months. Marcus had power, but power only works if you're afraid of it. And I was done being afraid. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not Angela, who'd warned me. Not Kyle, who felt guilty. Not my mom, who had enough to worry about with her recovery. I just kept showing up to work in my new diminished role, completing my assigned tasks without complaint, staying quiet and professional while I waited for the right moment. That moment came through an unexpected source. An accountant named Kira stopped me in the break room one afternoon, glancing around nervously before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Sure," I said. She lowered her voice even more. "Did you ever notice anything weird about Marcus's expense reports? Reimbursements that didn't quite make sense?" My pulse quickened. "Like what?" "Client dinners that I can't find corresponding meetings for. Hotel stays in cities where we don't have projects. Consulting fees paid to companies I can't verify." She looked genuinely distressed. I flagged some of it to my supervisor, but I was told to process everything anyway. We compared notes quietly over the next week. She showed me expense reports with irregular patterns. I showed her the altered safety documents and the timeline of my demotion. Neither of us knew what to do with the information, but we both knew it was wrong. Then the injury happened. A contractor fell at the Riverside site in early November. He was working on foundation prep in an area where I'd flagged drainage issues 6 months earlier, issues that Marcus had buried in altered reports. The man broke his leg in 2 places. It could have been much worse. The investigation started immediately, and my earlier safety warnings resurfaced because the original reports were still in the state regulatory database, even though they'd been scrubbed from our internal files. I felt sick when I heard about it. Guilty, even though I'd done everything I was supposed to do. I'd documented the problems. I'd submitted proper reports. But I hadn't pushed harder. I hadn't gone over Marcus's head. The accident triggered an internal compliance review. Suddenly people in dark suits were walking through the office, requesting documents, interviewing employees. Marcus laughed it off publicly, telling everyone it was routine, just standard procedure after any worksite injury. But privately, I noticed him micromanaging everyone. Demanding to see every document before it was submitted. Hovering over shoulders during interviews. He was worried. And he should have been. Compliance reached out to me directly during the 2nd week of the investigation. 2 women in neat blazers sat across from me in a small windowless room and asked me to walk them through my involvement with the Riverside safety protocols. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I just provided facts. I showed them the original reports I'd written, dated, and saved in my personal backup. I showed them the altered versions that appeared in the company files. I showed them email chains where I'd flagged issues and received vague responses. I watched their expressions change as they read. One of them, a woman named Patricia with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked up at me and said quietly, "Did anyone instruct you to alter these documents?" "No," I said. "I didn't alter anything. Those are my original reports. Someone else changed them after I submitted them." Patricia exchanged a glance with her colleague. "Do you have any idea who might have made those changes?" "I did. But I didn't say his name. I just said only department management had access to those files. They took copies of everything. They thanked me for my cooperation. They asked me not to discuss the investigation with anyone." I went back to my desk and waited. The smear campaign started 3 days later. Suddenly there were rumors circulating that I was unstable. That I'd been making accusations against colleagues because I was bitter about my demotion. That I couldn't handle criticism and had a history of conflicts with management. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Rumors spread faster than facts. Marcus assigned me impossible deadlines, clearly hoping I'd fail and prove I deserved the demotion. A permit application that normally took 2 weeks to process, due in 3 days. A site inspection report requiring data I didn't have access to anymore, due by end of business. I finished everything early. I stayed late, worked through lunch, double-checked every calculation and citation. I turned in perfect work, on time, with no complaints. Every completed assignment was another piece of evidence that the performance issues Marcus documented didn't actually exist. The paper trail the auditors uncovered was worse than I'd realized. It wasn't just the safety records. They found financial discrepancies, expense reports with forged signatures, contracts awarded to vendors who'd provided kickbacks, reimbursements for personal expenses disguised as business travel. Marcus had been running his department like a personal empire, and the Riverside project had given him enough budget and autonomy to hide it. The office buzzed with nervous whispers. People who'd ignored me for months suddenly wanted to talk, to explain they'd just been following orders, to make sure I knew they hadn't been involved in anything improper. I stayed professional. I didn't gloat or gossip. I just kept doing my work. Marcus's authority evaporated overnight. Meetings were cancelled. Decisions were reversed. Projects were reassigned. People who'd been terrified of him a week earlier now questioned his instructions openly. For the first time in months, coworkers spoke to me normally again. Angela apologized for not standing up for me earlier. Kyle asked if I wanted my old project back. I didn't know yet. I was still processing everything, still trying to figure out what came next. They put Marcus on administrative leave in late November. One day he was there, the next his office was empty and locked. Leadership began interviewing everyone on the team, asking careful questions about decision-making processes and documentation practices. When they interviewed me, I told the truth. Calmly and carefully, without emotion or exaggeration. I provided my timeline. My saved emails. My documentation of altered files and withheld bonuses and meetings where I'd been excluded. The lawyer taking notes looked at me and said, "Why didn't you report this sooner?" I thought about that question for a long moment. "Because I didn't think anyone would believe me," I said finally. "And because I was afraid of losing my job." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. The waiting was harder than the crisis. Weeks passed with no updates. I focused on my work, completed my assignments, and started applying for positions at other firms. I didn't know if I wanted to stay, even if they offered to fix everything. Some things, once broken, can't be fully repaired. Then in early December, leadership scheduled a company-wide meeting. Mandatory attendance, no agenda provided. Everyone gathered in the main conference room, nervous and speculating. The VP of Operations stood at the front, his expression serious. "We've completed our internal investigation," he began, and the room went silent. They didn't name Marcus specifically, but they didn't need to. The VP explained that serious misconduct had been uncovered during the compliance audit. Safety violations, financial manipulation, abuse of authority, retaliation against employees who raised concerns. We take these matters extremely seriously, he said. Several employees have been terminated. Others are facing disciplinary action. We're implementing new oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again. Then he looked directly at me. We also discovered that certain personnel decisions were made improperly. Those decisions are being reversed. Affected employees will be contacted individually. My demotion was reversed publicly the next day. My title restored. My bonuses reinstated, including the ones that had been withheld. I received a formal apology from the executive team and an offer to return to the Riverside project. The same room that had watched me fall now watched me stand back up. The offer from Kingston Engineering came 2 weeks later. They'd heard about my professionalism during the investigation, about how I'd maintained my standards even after being demoted, about the safety issues I'd documented that prevented more serious injuries. They wanted me for a senior leadership position. Better title. Better pay. Better culture. I walked through my old office one last time before I accepted. I looked at my former desk, now occupied by Kyle again, at the conference room where I'd been humiliated, at Marcus's empty office with its dark windows. I didn't feel angry anymore. Just tired and ready to move on. I gave my notice professionally. 2 weeks, completed projects, proper handoffs. Angela hugged me in the parking lot and told me she was proud of me. Kiera, the accountant who'd first raised concerns about the expense reports, asked me to be a reference for her own job search. You were brave, she said. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd survived something I should never have had to endure in the first place. But I took the compliment anyway. Starting at Kingston felt like breathing clean air after being underwater. They valued boundaries. They respected expertise. When I suggested improvements to their contract review process, people listened and implemented changes based on merit, not politics. My new supervisor was a woman named Helen who'd built her career on technical competence and ethical leadership. In our first one-on-one meeting, she asked me what I needed to be successful. No one had ever asked me that before. Clear expectations, I said. Honest feedback. And respect. Done, she said simply. It felt almost too easy. But that's what work was supposed to be like. Challenging but fair. Demanding but respectful. I heard through industry contacts that Marcus never worked in engineering again. The safety violations and financial fraud were too serious. Too documented. His reputation was destroyed, and not because I'd destroyed it, but because he'd built his career on a foundation of lies and abuse that eventually collapsed under its own weight. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I just acknowledged it and moved forward. Some people asked me if I felt vindicated. If I was glad he'd lost everything. The truth was more complicated. I was glad he couldn't hurt anyone else. I was glad the safety issues were taken seriously. But I wasn't glad that it had to get that bad before anyone listened. I wished someone had believed me sooner. I wished I hadn't had to collect evidence like I was building a legal case just to protect myself. But I didn't waste energy on wishes. I focused on what I could control. 6 months into my new position at Kingston, I was asked to speak on a panel about workplace ethics in engineering. They wanted me to talk about the importance of documentation and speaking up when you see problems. I almost said no. I didn't want to be defined by what Marcus had done to me. I didn't want to be the victim who became a cautionary tale. But then I thought about all the people who might be going through something similar. Who might think they're crazy. Who might believe they have no power. I said yes. I told my story calmly and factually. I explained the importance of saving emails, documenting conversations, and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. I talked about how technical competence isn't enough if you don't also stand up for what's right. Afterward, 3 women approached me privately. Each one told me a version of the same story. A boss who demanded too much. Who punished boundaries. Who made them feel small. I gave them my contact information. I told them they weren't alone. Because I wasn't destroyed by refusing to let Marcus intimidate me into silence. I was made stronger by it. Not because I wanted to be, but because I had to be. And that strength, that refusal to be erased, was something no one could ever take away from me. I walked out of that conference center into the evening air, breathing easily for the first time in over a year. My career was intact. My integrity was intact. My confidence felt earned, not forced. Marcus lost everything because of his own arrogance, his own choices, his own crimes. I didn't win by destroying him. I won by refusing to let him destroy me. And that made all the difference. If this story hit you in the gut and reminded you why knowing your worth changes everything, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story might be the one that makes you say, I wish I'd seen this sooner. The end.